I'm Allison Kapter. I'm an engineer here at Pilot.com. I've been asked to give a very short sales spiel before we get into the panel about how to hire and scale your engineering team. Pilot.com is the best way to get your books done. If you're a startup, please come buy some bookkeeping. We have a team of talented humans who have expertise in bookkeeping and a team of software engineers so that computers can do what they do best and humans can do what they do best also. All of my colleagues here in the Pilot t-shirts floating around would be happy to talk to you and answer your questions. So don't be shy, they're all very friendly. To start us off, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce yourselves very briefly with your names and your companies. And let's also do the size of the engineering team and maybe a little bit about the structure if that's informative, maybe a minute or less.
Should I go first? Hi, my name is Jessica. I am a founder and the CTO at Pilot. So I know Allison well. I have the great honor and pleasure of having worked with the same founding team for 10 years across 3 companies and 2 acquisitions. Hi, Jeff. So Pilot does bookkeeping. Pilot is 40 people and 9 folks in the engineering team. Before Pilot, our previous startup was acquired by Dropbox. At Dropbox, I was a director of engineering in a couple of functions. In one case, I helped run a 140-person engineering org that was responsible for all the platforms. So the mobile app, desktop client, web as a platform, their internal and external APIs. And then I also functioned in an operations capacity, mostly working with the executive team on a variety of engineering, product, and design decisions. So Dropbox was big, Pilot is smaller. Both have been interesting experiences. Fun fact, Pilot's engineering team is over 50% women.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Eric. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Lattice. Lattice is a company that provides HR software for startups and growing companies. We help people conduct performance reviews, one-on-ones, all the necessary HR stuff that you're probably not doing but should, and help you leverage and create good cultures for your employees. So at Lattice, we're about 50 people now and have an engineering team of 10. Engineering team of 10, engineering manager, and the CTO. So in my role, both the engineering, product, and design teams roll up to me. Before Lattice, I was the kind of head of engineering at a startup called Teespring. At Teespring, we had at one point about 30 engineers and 20 consultants on the engineering team. So that was about the size it got to. And I was there from living with the co-founders up until 2.5 years later with a much bigger team. Yeah, that's me.
Hey, I'm Dan. I am the CTO at Heap. We make software for creating data sets about your customers and making those data sets useful. So everything from answering questions like, do users use this feature, or is use of this feature predictive of churn or use of the product later, to which of my users is most likely to default on a loan all this time later, or integrate stuff with a complicated data set in a warehouse, all that good stuff. That's what we do. Many people have called it. A lot of people are saying it's the only good analytics tool. That's just what I hear. I have been there for 6 years. I'm our CTO. We are 110 people, of whom 25-ish are engineers, I think exactly 25. That's broken up into 2 orgs, one of which is infrastructural and one of which is direct user-facing things, the product team. There's a pretty heavy infrastructural component to what we do, so that's the majority of our engineers. And then within each of those orgs, engineers work on teams of between 2 and 7 people, depending on the people. And then each of those areas rolls up to one director of engineering who report directly to the CEO. And I'm just there.
Excellent. I'm Ammon. I'm co-founder of Triplebyte. And we are a hiring marketplace. And so engineers apply to us, and we put them through an interview process. And then companies on our platform can reach out and interview them and hire them. We're currently 10 engineers working on the product and machine learning team in San Francisco, and then 40 engineers around the US on the interview team conducting the interviews. Prior to Trilobite, I started another company, SocialCam, and we were acquired by Autodesk in 2012.
All right, thanks. We're going to have some time later on in the panel for audience questions, so make sure that you're thinking of your most interesting and spicy questions. Before we get started, just a quick poll to give us a feel for who's here. How many folks are founders of a company currently? Awesome, that's a lot. And how many folks are engineering managers or otherwise directly involved in hiring of engineers? A handful. Great. OK, so we're going to start with some questions around hiring and move into questions around scaling. Just to start us off, hiring your first engineer, how does that go? What does it look like?
Clearly, this is a solved problem that everyone has.
Yeah. So I can talk to our experience at Lattice and what we kind of did. So when we started Lattice, it was myself and my co-founder, Jack, and it was just us for the first 8 months. So I wrote all the code, and Jack did all the selling. And eventually, like the kind of tried and true startup advice is like, don't hire for as long as possible. And we really took that to heart. And eventually, we were like, OK, I can't be the one coding everything anymore. I kind of need some help. We have real customers now. And basically, throughout that time, previous coworkers of Jack and I's have been kind of reaching out, being like, oh, what are you working on? What are you doing? And kind of poking and prodding and trying to find out. So as soon as we kind of were like, hey, we're trying to hire someone, it was fairly easy for us because we had been talking to people the entire time and kind of keeping warm leads. And we just hired an engineer that I had previously worked with. So our circumstance was probably a little special for us, but I think nurturing leads, like you nurture sales leads, but doing it for hiring is really important because you never know when these warm leads you'll suddenly have an offer or they'll suddenly have a different life experience that allows them to work with you. And I think that's important to be doing from the very beginning.
This is a completely different answer. We had a lot of trouble with the nurture people we have worked with approach and get them to join our company. Like that is a totally standard piece of advice that you should absolutely try yourself. We had a lot of trouble getting that to actually work, and a lot of our early engineers came from direct inbounds, like they sent us emails with resumes and then we interviewed them, or we would put blog posts about the engineering work we do on Hacker News or something like that and get a lot of views from that, and people would just reach out from the bottoms of those. This is this is the opposite of what I think is expected at a startup, but it worked out really well for us. We found people who were spectacular. And another factor that made it at all tractable to hire, you should hire engineers early. Another fact that made it at all tractable was we were remote from very early on. The first person who joined after me was remote. And personally, I was very pessimistic about it, and I thought it was a really bad idea, and it was one of the best decisions we've ever made. So there's obviously a lot to choosing to be a distributed team and all the things you need to do to make that well and all of the benefits you get from that and the cost of it and all that. But definitely there is an inordinate number of extremely smart, driven, hardworking people who don't live within commuting distance of San Francisco. And if you are able to hire them, then you can hire them.
Yeah, and the market dynamics actually shift pretty substantially. So hiring your own engineers is a big advantage. So inbound applicants, interestingly, is generally a very small very small percentage of the hires at most companies, and especially early stage companies, because it's very hard to get inbound for most early stage companies. I think that's fairly anomalous, and that was an important source for you guys. I wonder if being remote was a big part of why that was able to work.
I think a big part of it was that we're to some degree a dev visible tool, and also we were pretty conscious from very early to just make ourselves visible, we do a lot of interesting engineering work, and you can make blog posts about it, and it's not that hard to get thousands of people to view those things, and you make a name for yourself pretty quickly.
So I think we should just state kind of the general advice here, which I think is extremely good advice, is that it almost always makes sense for the first few hires to come from your network, and just early stage companies. The things that bring applicants into larger companies are brand or them being very interested in the product, and that at an early stage can be very hard. You don't have many of those advantages. People have not heard of your product. Often it's barely built, and starting with your network, I think does make a huge amount of sense. At Trilobite, our product is a hiring platform, and so we actually kind of wanted, as a test of our product, to make our first hire through our platform, and so we made a big point of doing that. But the next few hires after that were people that I'd worked with previously, and I think that it was definitely a lot easier, let's say.
Pilot's first engineering hire was a friend of our CEO's from way back in high school, which is it's like in your network in a really old school way. So that's the case for Pilot. I think things that are like worthwhile to keep in mind when making the first couple of engineering hires are in terms of reinforcing the culture that you want to be establishing for your engineering team and for the company. This person is going to have disproportionate impact on that, and they're also going to be very visible in the process of evaluabe and trying to close future candidates. So keeping in mind, you maybe work with the network that you have, or you work with the leads that you have for early hires, but to the extent that you can keep in mind their disproportionate impact on your ability to close future engineers is important.
This is incredibly true, and we underweighted this. I think a common piece of advice is make sure at least one of your early-ish hires is diverse along any of the axes of diversity, because if your team is 12 people that's non-diverse, that becomes a problem. One that we didn't know about, or that I wish I knew back then, is if you can find a person in your early set of hires who is like a spark plug, who makes the room fun and is just a fun person to be around, that absolutely changes the character of the office and the experience that candidates have when they're on site, and what it's like to go out for dinner with your team. It is not hard to find to accidentally find yourself in a team of 7 engineers who just aren't the life of the party. We all are very cool. Yeah, yes, of course. I'm sure you're all very cool. But if you can, we definitely hired some people later who were just extremely naturally fun, outgoing people who make the room fun. And if I were to do it again, I would just make sure to make that happen in our first 5-ish people.
Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that it can be harmful from a diversity perspective to be evaluating on things other than technical skill. So you have to balance that as well, right? That those qualities do matter, but also be very careful about making sure that you're not judging on just, does this person seem like someone who I personally want to be friends with, because we want to be friends with people who are similar to us in many cases.
Okay, so we're definitely going to circle back to a conversation about diversity in just a minute here, but I want to start with the comment about brand and closing candidates. So if everyone's a relatively small company, relatively less well-known, and you're not competing on salary with the Googles and Facebooks of the world. So how do you attract and close candidates? And basically, how do you make the case for your company as a great place to work as an engineer?
I guess I can start again. So at Lattice, what's really useful for us is we're solving a problem that almost all of our candidates have dealt with in the past, which is really bad company cultures. We basically explain our product. We explain that we really care about making cultures better, that making sure that managers are having lots of communication, that you're receiving lots of feedback, that you're getting all this career growth. And we practice what we preach at Lattice too, right? We obviously use our own product and really care about this. And that's really, really attractive to candidates, because almost everyone has worked at a place that they didn't feel appreciated, or they didn't feel like they were getting the feedback that they needed, and they weren't growing. And they're like, wow, I really wish Lattice was at my company a few years ago. That's why I'm leaving now. So normally we're talking to people that are kind of disenfranchised, or they don't feel disillusioned with their company. And so we're kind of like this breath of fresh air that talks to all these problems. I'd also say we try and leverage, especially really early on, whatever star power we could to wow people. So my co-founder's brothers, Sam Altman, and we definitely used that card a few times to close people. And so yeah, that feels really bad, and it was for sure, it was gross. But you got to use what you got to close people.
I appreciate the transparency on that.
Yeah, this is all going to be in the recording, but I'm a very transparent person, so. I think being honest and open with people as well is also really, really important. like you're a extremely small company compared to other people that they may be talking to. And I think joining a startup means you get to participate in the startup experience and growing and seeing the numbers and being a first-time hirer potentially and all that. And I think the more you can be transparent and honest with people, the more you can make them feel like they're going to be part of this thing, especially from the early days. Like that's really, really exciting for most people.
Yeah, I think the tried and true answer to this is you have to sell the smallness of it. You have to absolutely lean on the thing that you have an advantage on, which is that it's tiny and you will grow a ton here. If you go to some place like Google, you'll make 50 or 100K a year more, but at like 10 years later, you'll be like a mediocre engineer. And if you join this thing, you'll be in way over your head in a way that Google would never put you in over your head, and your growth is compounding. And there's like a really deep and effective story that you can tell here that I feel like every small company that hires well absolutely has to lean on. There are other ways you can lean on your smallness. Like you can give people a lot more attention than they're ever going to get at a large company. Like one thing we do is we give candidates that we give offers a one-page description of why we liked them so much, like with all kinds of details from the interviews. Like in this interview, you mentioned this, we thought that was really clever, no one ever mentions this, and this part, blah, blah, blah. Which is actually not that hard to do because hopefully you have those thoughts and are very thoughtful about why you were hiring someone. But that's like a level of personal touch and attention that you're not going to get from someplace like Facebook or Google. So you can lean on those kinds of factors to create like a tribe or make you feel like you're a part of something or something like that. But absolutely, like you have to lean on the growth and the fact that this will just be an adventure and it'll rocket ship your career.
Yeah, so the way that I like to think about this, and like speaking in generalities first, and we can talk about Pilot. So one example that's been given is like leveraging your smallness. Stepping back even further from that, I think it's super important for founders or for early stage companies to have a lot of clarity around who they want their competition to be when closing candidates, and to like root that in what your true needs as a company are. So it is like mathematically impossible for every tech company to employ the 99th percentile engineers. And it is also, like by the historical record, self-evident that it doesn't require 99th percentile engineers to do all kinds of just to solve all of the problems that all the different companies are solving. In some cases, like the nature of the tech portion of your company is the hard part, and in some cases it's not the hard part, it's the easier part, and there are like a broad range of people of a broad range of capabilities who could successfully implement that part of your business. And like having clarity on like what types of engineers or sort of what makes for a good engineer. That's like there's like a lot of diversity to that answer, but sort of where you want to be competing for engineers, you can set yourself up for an easier or harder time depending on like what the true needs of your business are. So you can like choose to compete against Google, Facebook, and all of the other hot tech startups if that is what you want to do, or if that is what your true need is. Or you can also select yourself into like a different competitive pool that like has like good engineers in it, but are perhaps not 99th percentile engineers. And it's like worth being intellectually honest about that. So that's like thing number one. And then the second thing is sort of riffing on sort of capitalizing on the smallness. There are other things that you can also capitalize on that are totally valid. And like the important thing, the meta thing or the important thing is like you should have like clarity about what your wedge is, or like what is the thing that you want to be the thing that makes your company stand out in competition with other companies. And this could be, and like smallness is hard if your competition is a bunch of other like early stage companies. But so your wedge can be like, for some people, like the mission is really important. Or like if you're working on a startup where it's like a very mission-driven thing, you will attract people who are attracted to that mission, and you won't attract people who aren't attracted to that mission, but that's great, that can be your wedge. Or you can just pay people more money. Like that's a totally valid strategy that like works with hedge funds. Like some people really respond to money. You could outpay people. Or you can build up a narrative around having a really great team, like the quality of the engineering team or the quality of the culture, and like lean into that. And there are other things that you can do too, but like they're all valid strategies. It just like you should have clarity about which one you're trying to implement, because if you're like not really implementing any of them and you're like not competitive on pay, but also the thing that you're doing, it maybe doesn't like natively resonate with most people mission-wise, and you don't have like specific cultural draws, you end up losing to other companies. And so with Pilot, we're a bookkeeping firm. How much did I care about bookkeeping before I started Pilot? Well, I found my taxes late and definitely didn't care about it at all. I'm now extremely passionate about bookkeeping. I joke with Allison about starting a bank transaction memo consortium because I care so much about the shape of transactions these days. And so like I have a passion for Pilot and bookkeeping now, but like most people on the planet like weren't born wanting to be bookkeepers, and like the way that we attract great engineers and also great people in other functions to Pilot is like not going to be like our wedge is not going to be the mission, with the exception of Larissa, who loves bookkeeping. She loves bookkeeping. And so we have to play in some other space, right? And like so we end up, so for us, we actually do believe that like building a culture around and like playing in the competitive space with the 99th percentile engineers actually is like a core like strategic decision for us, because we're not going to win on the money, we're not going to win on the mission, so we have to do that's going to be our wedge, and we're like willing to be committed to that even if it means that we're in a pretty tough playing field.
I think what's worked the best for us is not compromising on the quality of the people we're hiring, but finding and going after undervalued engineers, right? So if you're Google and a large portion of programmers out there are applying to you, you can be very selective on things that only roughly correlate with skill. So you can afford to say, we're going to only talk to people who have resumes that have other well-known companies on them, or have a top 10 CS school. And if you get enough applicants, that works, right? People with those credentials as a group are going to be better than people who don't have those credentials. But the pool of people who don't have those credentials is so enormous that there is still a vast number of top skilled engineers who learn their skills in some other way. Perhaps they were self-taught and have been working in some defense contractor for the last 5 years. Right? That's not a profile that companies tend to look positively on, but there absolutely are some extremely skilled engineers who are in that situation. And so we've had a lot of luck, and again, it's easier for us because our core product is this, but we've had a lot of luck dropping some of the preconceptions about what skilled engineers look like, screening people, finding people who are very strong engineers who come from surprising backgrounds, and then making them offers. And at that point, we're not in competition. No one else is making that person an offer. Google's still not making that person an offer. And so that person is very happy to accept and is extremely excited and extremely grateful to have the opportunity. Yeah, I think that's an approach that can work.
But then Triplebyte makes it hard. So we use Triplebyte. Triplebyte's great. But then you find all of these great folks, and then like your platform causes them to have like a super competitive offer environment, which is great. It's great. The pool expansion is wonderful. Yes.
Great. So on the topic of pool expansion, let's circle back to the idea of building a diverse engineering team. And this is something that there's a lot of conversation, especially in the last couple of years, about hiring women. Of course, there are other axes of diversity. I think there's a less mature conversation about addressing those. What is your strategy as an early team that maybe is relying more on network, and your network is more likely to be homogenous? And in particular, like what trade-offs are you willing to make?
Sure. I think. Well, so the first is just caring about it and realizing that it is particularly important. When you're hiring 3 people, it's harder to talk meaningfully about ratios, right? So I don't think you should feel bad from a statistics perspective if your first 3 employees aren't diverse. And yet, if you make that argument, you are making it harder for yourself in the future, right? It is people reasonably want to join a team where they see people like themselves who are successful there, and they can tell that it's a supportive environment. And so I think, in spite of the fact that there's not kind of a statistical argument there, I do think companies should think about that from the beginning. And that does just run, to a certain extent, counter to the advice of hiring from your network. Right? If you happen to have a diverse network, and that's excellent, then that's a win-win for you. But maybe slowing down a bit, maybe waiting a little bit longer to make the first hires in order to search more broadly and make sure that from the beginning, there's a good diversity of people on the team.
And riffing on that, because you said it's like slowing down, which I think is like a really important thing to say. So working at Dropbox was really fascinating. So let's talk. I want to talk about that like at scale for just a minute. But we can also talk about Pilot. But like at scale or preparing yourself for bigger scales of hiring, like this stuff gets really fascinating and requires there's a real test of the commitment to the ideals when you want to be growing quickly or when you're doing this at scale. So Dropbox, love Dropbox, super fascinating company, learned a ton from working there. I was probably the person in engineering most involved with engineering recruiting while I was there. From all sort of in every stage of the process, in that I was like a part of the executive team that was like making decisions about like what the top line growth was going to be and like commitments to diversity that we were going to publish to the company. I was also like a debrief moderator, and I was also an interviewer, and I was also part of like a committee that stewarded the health of the evaluation process. So like super involved. And the thing that was fascinating about Dropbox was that there was like very strong. There's like the values around like believing in the value of a diverse team for a bunch of reasons, including that like you build better, but also it's just like the right thing to do. Like the total values alignment there from the top down and from the bottom up. But then just like a perennial inability to actually move the needle on the diversity of teams like year over year. And despite like public commitments to like sort of like changing what the top of the funnel or what like the resulting like diversity on teams look like. And what was so interesting, so it was like so interesting to observe like this sort of commitment to the values with like a lack of follow through on it. And what it always came down to was that Dropbox wanted to grow really quickly. And when it came to needing to make a trade-off between like hitting your volume and like hitting your diversity goals, volume always won. And this was like not a resourcing question. It was like entirely a prioritization question. Like when you think about like incentives for the recruiting team, incentives for the engineering managers, like it all falls out of what the number one priority was, and the number one priority always ended up being volume. And so that's like this is like when Dropbox is several thousand people, when the engineering team has hundreds of people on it. Like that's at a scale that is not what most of us in this room are currently dealing with, but that it's reflected like that the fact that it comes down to clarity on priorities and like a willingness to make the trade-offs that allow you to adhere to those priorities is still true at a smaller scale. And so when you say slowing down, that's like exactly right? Because potentially, like some of us are lucky about our networks or about like the success with other recruiting tools that enable a diverse top of the funnel, but often it may require taking the time to build out a diverse top of the funnel to achieve the diversity results that you're looking for. And so that requires a commitment to potentially growing slower. And so like real clarity about that commitment and like alignment at with the founding team or with you and the engineering managers is like you like have to have that buy-in and like to be willing to make the trade-off on the speed on that. And just like having clarity about that is really important because a lot of people like to talk the talk on it, but they don't walk the walk when it comes to the trade-offs that are implicit in the prioritization. Yeah. I mean, Pilot's spoiled because I've like spent my entire adult life building a network full of women to start. And again, not that women are the only demographic that we're talking about, but it gives my life is a little bit easier to start with, and that allows us to invest more in other demographics that we want to be focusing on. And then I also I had a very clear commitment with the founding team from the outset. I was like, we're going to hold hands and we're going to agree that we're going to. I'm allowed to control what recruiting channels we're focusing on to promote a diverse top of the funnel. And if that means mostly turning off and not paying attention to inbound interest, then that's what we're going to do. And if that means we grow slower because we're going to focus on using companies like Triplebyte and then focusing on building relationships with organizations that attract diverse talent pools like Recurse Center, Hackbride Academy, like there's like a bunch of institutions, like we're willing to make that trade-off on like where we focus the energy on our channels.
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly hard problem, and that trade-off that both of you are describing is very real, and it is incredibly hard to decide to not hire an engineer that you like and like finally think, like it's really hard to find engineers who are on the market at all who are really strong and like you think you can hire. So if you imagine that you're like a 4-person team or a 3-person team or a 6-person team and you would kill to just get this one feature out the door that you think is going to get you product market fit, or you're in some kind of foot race with some other competitor, like making the decision to slow down is like to some degree existential and is like really, really hard to be committed to. Just to riff off, I think the phrase top of the funnel is like incredibly prescient here. We paid a lot of attention to ways within the funnel that there might be bias, but by far the top of the funnel is just incredibly skewed, not even for network reasons in our case, like just due to the people who emailed us on the internet or due to God knows what other factors, but we had an incredibly hard time building a diverse top of funnel, and it's not a necessarily easy thing to do. Like building a diverse top of funnel kind of reduces to like make friends who fit a demographic, which is like a weird and motivated thing to do. So like I think the least bad option, or like one of the most fruitful things that you can do here is definitely building relationships with organizations that already do this. Like we also adore Recurse Center, which has a really diverse group of very talented people, and they have done the work for you of having a diverse network that attracts people from all different walks of life who are really good engineers. But trying to build that yourself when you're 3 people and are also trying to get a product off the ground and are also trying to figure out what is marketing and like 50 other things, like is a really, really difficult thing to do.
So let's switch to the risk side of the hiring equation. What does a bad hire look like, and what do you do?
Yeah, bad hires. I think that the tricky bit is you will know you've made a bad hire very quickly. Almost always, like things will not work out. What we've tried doing is making sure that we always try and hire 2 people around the same time for similar roles. That way you can kind of compare and contrast, and even know is there like a systematic failure of the company, or is this truly like an individual issue here, right? Maybe just the onboarding program is busted and that's why like they're not getting up to speed, versus like this is truly like an individual. And you know, I think the classic startup advice of hire slow, fire fast is very true, and I don't think I've yet to meet someone who's actually done that. I think I've only heard stories of I wish I let go of this person sooner. Never like I wish I didn't let go of this person. It's almost assuredly your team's going to feel better, you're going to feel better, they're going to feel better, because normally that means that they're in a really bad situation. I think the important thing is to, while you probably won't do it fast enough, to like fix the issue, and be really honest that like this was a screw up of yours, not theirs. Like you are the one that made the bad hire. Like there's nothing wrong with them. Your system of hiring was busted, and like learn like what signal did you not grab during the interview process or what have you. And then we've always tried to be really, really generous with the people we've let go and help them get their next job, be a referral, like open up our networks, do whatever we can to make the transition as easy as possible for them, but to do it. And that's the hard part.
Yeah, you'll know very quickly, like to put numbers on it, you'll probably know within 2 weeks that like something is kind of off. We have absolutely had situations where we used to do a lot of trial periods, and if that's something you can get away with, I would highly encourage it. By trial period, I mean work with us for a month, and we'll, like if we're not sure about you, or we're not sure about the situation or something like that, or like you can often sell it as something that's beneficial on both sides, because it is. If you can do that, you can, like, that's a good thing to lean on. And we've absolutely had situations in trial periods where literally by the end of the first day, it was clear that this person was wonderful, and we absolutely wanted to hire them. And we like cut the trial period short after 2 weeks and just try to make a conversion offer. But you'll probably know within like pretty quickly that, especially when you're really small, and arguably if you're on a 4-person team and can't recognize that someone isn't working out, like you probably don't deserve, like it's to some degree your ability to discern things determines what you are capable of, the bar you're capable of keeping your team at. You probably know pretty quickly. You probably waited too long by the time you actually let go of someone. You should always do all the things, all the standard things to try to make it as mutual as not to make it as mutual as possible, but to make it as warm-spirited as possible and leave a good taste in everybody's mouth and try to help them get a new job and be generous with severance and all that stuff. But in addition to, you probably waited too long. You probably waited too long to be frank with them about the fact that things aren't going well or that things aren't working out. And this is often really hard to do, especially if you've never done it before, because often it's really hard to turn it into objective factors. Like it's really difficult to say like you're just not getting that much done, or like I don't expect that this thing should take 4 days. What do we do here? But if you don't, you're not doing anyone any favors by pretending that things are fine, especially the other people on the team to whom I think you owe teammates that are of their caliber. And if you don't, make the right interventions, you're not going to get it. But yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. It will happen. You should absolutely retrospect it whenever anything happens that doesn't work out. You should absolutely make adjustments to your interview pipeline. You will never make an interview pipeline that is absolutely bulletproof. And I would actually argue, as your organization scales, it is a really interesting metric to track how long it takes to determine that someone isn't working out. Like, as your organization scales, if it takes you 6 months to realize a new hire is like definitely not a fit, that I think says something about the scale or structure of your engineering management or something like that. And likewise, on the flip side, if you hire someone who's a completely wonderful, talented engineer, how long does it take for the executive team to be aware of this? Like when you're 4 people, you'll probably know within a week or 2, maybe even less than that. But when you're 50 people, that could be 3 weeks, that could be 6 months, and like that metric I think says a lot about your engineering organization and what its priorities are.
So I'm gonna.
Oh wait, I have a slightly not contrarian isn't the right word, but I think in my experience, folks who are just like grossly underperforming is like the minority case of like performance management challenges. I mean, so usually if people like do well enough, in my experience, when folks do well enough in the interview process to get an offer, they're like in some space of like good-ish to like crushing it. And like the hard case is when folks are like, you had an expectation for what they would bring to the team or to the company, and they're not hitting that. They're contributing. There's like some productivity there, but it's like not what you were expecting or not what you want it to be, or you don't see growth from like the baseline established when they came in, like the growth that you were expecting to see. And that's like the much harder, like, I don't think I've ever been in an organization that has like that actually pulls the trigger on like firing folks who are like not meeting expectations but are not like grossly underperforming. That's just really tough to do emotionally. It's like tough for the team if there's not like clear underperformance. They're just sort of middlingly going about things and like not particularly growing. And so that's like a really interesting case to think about in terms of like how would you suss that out in the evaluation process, and like what do you do in those cases? Maybe in some cases you do fire people that like plateau earlier than, like maybe companies have a philosophy about where it's acceptable to plateau, and then like you do take action. I find that to be like quite uncommon. And then it's about like how do you best leverage this person's strengths, knowing that maybe their ceiling is lower than you were expecting. And it's like a really interesting, hard management challenge.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I completely agree. Like, it's very rare that you're just going to hire someone that just, like, flat out can't do the work or something like that. It's always going to be they're a really great person. They love your company. They're such a fun, awesome. They have cute kids. Like, it's like they have all these wonderful traits, and yet they're not meeting expectations. And that's where it's really, really tough. In our circumstance, the way how we've dealt that is the key metric we look at is how are they perceived by their peers when it comes to the work, not like in their personality, but like, are they someone that their peers can trust to get the job done, or that I want them on my team? Because as soon as they lose the trust of their peers, they're not doing anyone any favor by being at your company anymore. Even if they're somewhat productive, like, if you went to someone and be like, hey, you're the new manager, who are you picking for your team? Like, or would you be happy if this person was your team? And if the answer is like, honestly, no, like I'd rather like work with this person or that person, like that's when you know you have to make a change. And I think we've used that as a pretty strong litmus test for us.
Yeah, I think we actually have a pretty similar, I think we actually have been fairly effective at discerning the difference between mediocrity that has a future and mediocrity that is actually just mediocrity, and you kind of have to, it's like not going to work out long term unless you're okay with that. And yeah, there's a million signals like this, like you notice that someone on the team feels the need to always check that person's work more carefully, or you go to a sprint planning meeting and you notice that the team always sort of has an unspoken thing that they do the easiest thing, or like this, the safest thing, or like you'll see little, like in human groups you will see some sort of like status pecking order-y thing sort of start to shake out, and if like someone isn't growing in the scope of stuff that they can do, then like you will still see it, and like it will be hard to talk about because it is not objective gross failure. You won't see someone who like brings down the stack every day because they just like are typing with their elbows. Like that's not a real thing. But yeah, like I think that's a really smart way to handle this.
I want to make sure we save some time for questions from audience here. So let's go ahead and switch to that. And we've spent most of our time so far on hiring. So if you have questions on the scaling side of building and growing your engineering team, I want to prioritize those questions. Does anyone have one that they want to start us out with? I'm going to summarize for the benefit of the recording. So the question is about the kinds of engineers that you have early on, and when that changes to needing a different kind of engineer as your company matures. How do you handle that?
I would say, maybe this is a hot take, I'm not sure, but I say like the people that are with you early on don't need to be the people that are with you forever. And that's really brutal, and like this is coming from like a very like honest and transparent place, which is companies change. Just like when you go through a divorce, it's not necessarily means that anyone failed, it just means that they drifted apart. The things that they want out of that relationship are different now. And like it's very similar with companies. Companies, when they're 3 people, are very, very, very different than when they're 100, and that person may not be a good fit at the 100 scale. Like their skills don't match, they're not interested in it because they don't like the bureaucracy, they don't like the stuff that's been introduced with the company. And it's totally fine for you to go your own separate ways at that point. Like you should do whatever you shouldn't have it so their options are taken away from them, with the 90-day nonsense. Like you should make sure that they get to keep their options and do whatever and make it easy for them to transition on. But you thank them for all that they've done so far, but like they should find a place that they're happy. And like you're not that place anymore.
I think if you're working on something with a high technical ceiling, or something where there's an endless amount, there are definitely some startups where you kind of finish the product. But if you're working on something where there's always a frontier, that kind of person you're describing, who is really scrappy and takes good initiative and has good sort of common sense about what to do, I would hope that there would always be some thing that you can have them do. And the advantage they bring isn't just those skills, it's also years and years of context about the company. So they know the user way better than any of your other engineers. They were around forever. They know a million decisions and why everything is the way it is. And you can lean on that and that sort of scrappy attitude you're talking about to like always be on that sort of frontier. So I would hope that there's some degree of flexibility in whatever engineering organization you're talking about, that you can like get value out of it. We've done this, we lean on it pretty heavily. We love it, I highly recommend it. There's standard best practices you can look up in any blog post, like pay people a little bit above market when they're doing it because they're not getting equity and all that stuff. There's no comparison between an interview process and actually working with someone to determine what it's actually like to work with someone. but it's really very limiting in terms of who can do that. Like, it'll definitely limit your ability to close engineers if you're selling them on maybe working here, or it's really hard to recruit someone who is like has a family or any degree of need for stability in their life at all if you're asking them. We did once have someone who took a 1-month vacation to do a trial period with us, but that's like, I'm always amazed when I talk to other people who make that a norm at their company at scale.
Yeah, for a first hire, I think it's just not going to work because early stage startups are basically struggling to get applicants, right? They have a top of the funnel problem. If you're a huge company and everyone's applying and you have a great brand, you can afford to trade some drop off for a more accurate evaluation process. And it definitely is, I agree, it definitely is a more accurate evaluation process. Unless you're lucky. If you get someone they want to do that, that's great. Like, it really is better for you and probably better for them too, because they can see if they fit in. But at a very early stage for your first few hires, I think it's pretty improbable that most companies will be able to pull that off. One thing that we've done, so two answers. One, if you can call in investors, friends. So this is going to mostly happen at an early stage company. So calling in investors, calling in people you know from a startup accelerator or friends and having them run a portion of your interview if you're hiring for a specialist in a skill you don't have, I think makes a lot of sense. One kind of fallback approach that we've used that actually works pretty well across everything actually is to get in with the person, ask them a question in their technical area, they'll give an answer, you won't understand it, and then say, oh, I don't understand that, can you explain that to me? And if you truly are a skilled engineer and they truly are a specialist in this area, they should be able to have a conversation where they explain everything to you in full depth in terms that you understand. And someone not being able to do that is not ironclad, but a pretty strong indicator that they aren't actually strong in that area. I'll answer super briefly here, and then you can come talk to me after. I'm happy to talk in full depth. That's mostly just a observation, thing on our side. We're not judgmental about. There are tons of different ways you can run an interview, and there are things that you can do wrong that make it less accurate. Absolutely, sort of running less structured interviews allows other sorts of signal to creep in. We've standardized our process, and to a certain extent, standardizes the process that companies on our platform use, mostly as a convenience measure, so that we're able to, we're facing a fairly large operations challenge to handle this all at scale, and that becomes tractable if everyone is operating in a defined way. It's as simple as that.
So I think it's about creating the right environment. So at Lattice, 2 of the 10 engineers are remote, which is really bad. Like, it's a really bad environment for them because you basically have the HQ where everyone speaks and talks around the water cooler, and then you have those people. Now, our 2 remote engineers happen to be phenomenal and are able to be absolutely produce in a bad environment. But I think if you want to encourage a remote environment, you have to set them up for success. You have to change the way you communicate, change the way that even your dev tools work so that it can facilitate them to be successful. And you're setting up systems in place so that they can't help but be successful. So that's also really important as you're an engineering leader or building out an engineering team, is that you're putting in systems in place that people, like the pit of success, right? They can't help but do the right things that make them successful at your business.
Just to speak to that in a slightly more narrow way, Heap has been remote since very early on. The team right now is around 40% remote. It's been that way forever. There's a PhD thesis to be done on what makes remote work really well, but it has absolutely not been our experience that remote people get less done. And in fact, I would generally expect a person working without the distractions of your office to get more done. There's definitely things to look for when you're hiring a remote person. I think one of the biggest signals you should look for is degree of structure in their life. You want someone who isn't going to be coding from bed, or who has a pretend commute to their living room, or who goes to a WeWork, or takes a shower every day, whatever. You need some kind of structure, because things will fall apart and people will go crazy after 6 months, or something could happen. But I would hope that a strong, a talented engineer that you hire who's remote can get a really impressive amount done. It's only at scale that you start to see a lot of the problems around keeping them in the loop or keeping them feeling a part of the team or all of that kind of stuff. But very early on, I wouldn't expect any of that. Just
to provide maybe a little bit of a slant on this. So Pilot has no distributed anybody. Ksplice, our first startup, had a highly distributed team across many, many time zones. Ksplice was a technology that involved stuff with the Linux kernel. So like the DNA of the team was very much rooted in like an open source discipline about distributed engineering teams. So we got a lot of experience operating like as a distributed engineering team in a business context through that company. And I think that people's individual productivity, it certainly can be very high, if not higher, due to a lack of distractions when people, be it like work from home or work remotely. I think the thing that is like, the thing that, as far as I have personally experienced, that is like not yet solved is that working something out in person is like a higher bandwidth way of doing it than being on a conference call or being on a phone call or being on Slack or whatever. And like so that there is like a trade-off there on how to have like the highest bandwidth conversations to problem solve and to build trust. And I hope it wouldn't be controversial to say that there isn't a higher, there's no way to emulate that bandwidth. You can do your best to offset it and like weigh the pros and cons of the benefits of like being able to hire for a distributed team where like the talent pool is augmented by that fact. But like the downsides of like not having that in-person high bandwidth channel most of the time, like so for Pilot, that in particular, given that for Pilot's engineering team, our customer is really our product specialist team, the folks who do the bookkeeping who are in the office with us. That would be difficult or we would not choose to make that trade-off with this company, with this setup. Which is not to say that it can't work in a bunch of different environments, and you can't mitigate some of the challenges of being on a distributed team, but that bandwidth issue is still like that can be a deal breaker in some contexts.
I would also say that like you have to make sure you're making the right trade-offs, like you were saying, and making sure that your business is a business that like everyone needs to be in the same place, or are you a business that can have a distributed team? And even different roles have different requirements around this. And so it's not, I don't think you should make the decision, oh, we're going to be distributed without like looking at all these other factors, right? Which are very important of even, can you facilitate this, or how important is it that like communication, sometimes you can have a business where communication really isn't a big part of this, or there's certain engineering roles where they can just kind of be off on their own and do their thing, and you don't need this like super high cohesion between individuals. But like a support role or a team that is working on a product that requires like instantaneous turning to your left, talking to this person stuff, like you probably can't do distributed. So I think you shouldn't try and fit a square peg into a round hole. And you should really be honest about what is your business and what is your requirements. Yeah, I can speak to this. We had a big at Teespring, we had a large part, and it grew over time, that was contract work instead of full-time. So for us, it was working with like a outside dev firm, right? We worked with a group down in Argentina called something Pines, Twin Pines. They're really, really great. If you ever want to work with like an outside dev team, like I would highly recommend these guys. They're really phenomenal programmers. And what we used them for was, one, we didn't use them in the beginning. It was all kind of engineers. We probably started using them right when the engineering team was probably around 25 or so, as we started to do staff augmentation. And we used them for non-core. Actually, they became core eventually, but like we started off with like non-core projects. So like integrations, things like that, that is like stuff that like it doesn't matter. There's no proprietary like technology here. It's just kind of like you have to do it. And like an integration between SFTP servers is just going to be kind of the same no matter who programs it. And that was like a really great use in the beginning, and it freed up our engineering resources to work on kind of the more things that you need a lot more context for, right? You need to understand the business much more carefully. This is something that we've thought of using at Lattice as well for some of our like integration work. Mobile was like, we had an outside dev firm do that for us because we had the APIs already, but we didn't have anyone that had mobile experience. It would be hard to hire mobile engineers, and we don't really need a full-time mobile engineer, honestly. So like, at least back then. So I think it's finding things that require very little context, right, to get the job done, especially because like you're going to have this kind of communication and all that kind of stuff. That's what's worked well for my experience in the past.
So Trilobite also, we employ 40 remote contract engineers. And in our case, there's a separation of the work. So when we launched, the in-house engineering team, including me, was spending half or 3/4 or all of our time doing interviews as we tested and improved the interview. And at some point, it became hard to hire for that role. And it's hard because we do a lot to standardize the evaluation, but it still does fundamentally take someone very skilled in the relevant areas to do that work. And so we essentially went remote contractors to take advantage of the supply of people who want to work remotely. So we essentially offer, it's structured as contracting, although many of them are working 40 more hours a week. And this allows them to set their own schedule and work from anywhere in the United States. And sometimes some of them go and travel around the world. And essentially that allows us to tap into a much larger supply of labor and hire super strong engineers to do this task. So it's not really, none of our machine learning work, none of our product work is being done remotely. So I can't really speak to how to think about that.
All right, let's go ahead and break there. Thanks everyone for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.